You know, the good news is that battlefield medical care has improved greatly since I was a young Marine. Today, many soldiers make it home alive because of such sophisticated and competent care. But as you may know, traumatic brain injury is one of the more common injuries in this war, and I know a little bit about that. 16 years ago, I experienced a cerebral hemorrhage followed by a stroke. My traumatic brain injury was caused by a bleeding blood vessel in my brain, cause unknown, and not by enemy action. I was in a coma, out of it for a couple of months, had my wake-up day, and then started my recovery. Traumatic brain injury is an injury that requires years of medical attention and rehabilitation. Yet your life is changed forever. I urge you to support these young veterans and their families and help them get the care they must have if there is any chance for them to have a meaningful life. We must protect those who serve to protect us. We owe them and their families in so many ways. There are many ways to be a patriot, and today let us also thank all people who have made a choice to contribute to this country in any way, to this state and to our community. Thank a friend for making this a better place to live. Thank a police officer. Thank a fireman. Thank a bus driver or anyone who serves others. And thank a coach, a music director, a teacher, or anyone else who works to protect and develop our youth. Lastly, let us remember the words, "We the people." The strength and power of this country rests in us. And each of the veterans we honor today understood that duty. Let us learn from them and let us honor our duty to fulfill the hope and dreams that were fought for right here in Princeton. We are the people, and we must work to protect the idea that became this country. God bless the United States of America and all our patriots. Semper Fi.
Hi, I'm Teena Cahill, and welcome to Wisdom and Beyond. Today I thought what we could do is talk a little bit about why I do these shows and why it is that I'm speaking all over the country and actually now all over the world on resilience and leadership and how to take care of yourself in tough times. Many of you know that I live here in Princeton with my husband, Brooks Dyer. Brooks was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserves. He was a Marine Corps fighter pilot and a captain with a major airline. And 16 years ago, Brooks had a cerebral hemorrhage and a stroke and then a spinal cord injury. And for anyone in the audience listening, or for anyone, when you go through these really tough times, you know it takes a while to get your situation stabilized and figure out how you're going to design your future, because your future has probably changed from what you had originally had in mind. So it took about 10 years to get the family stabilized, and a few years ago, maybe about 4 years ago, I was over at my house, and it was the anniversary of when all of these problems had happened for Brooks, and I realized I was feeling a little sad. And I said to myself, Teena, why are you feeling sad? You have this great life, great friends, great family. Brooks has gone past any expectation. What is your problem? And I realized I was having something called an anniversary response. Frequently on the anniversary of some significant thing in our life, we sort of have an emotional reaction to that. And I was feeling a little bit sad about that. And so I said to myself, well, now that you know what that's about, what is it that you're sad about since your life is so great? And I realized that I was no longer mourning what had happened to Brooks or how the changes had happened in the family. What I was really missing was my future that was to have been. I'm an ambitious woman just like many of the men and women watching this show right now. I had gone through high school and college doing public speaking, and in the early parts of my career I had done a lot of public speaking fundraising events, and I had always decided sometime when the kids grew up that perhaps I would take the show on the road. But I had spent about the last 2 years, while having a great time, really working to see what I could do to help Brooks reach his potential and how we could stabilize everything for all of us. So I said to myself, well, Brooks is pretty stable. We now live in an extended family home. Life is great. Maybe this is the time for me to see what I can do about that. So I called an agent, someone I never knew, and I said, hi, my name's Teena Cahill. I've decided to be one of the top speakers in the country. Would you like to represent me? Because if you have nothing, you sort of just have to go overboard. And she said, who are you? Who's this wacko? But eventually she said, make a tape and we'll see. And that was the beginning of me trying to develop this speaking career, which has now become so big that I'm all over the world all the time, about ready to leave Istanbul. I thought it was hot in Princeton today. It's even hotter in Istanbul. And, but at the beginning, I had a hard time getting people to even let me speak for free. I would call them up and say, hi, I'm Teena Cahill. I'd like to speak to your group on resilience and how to manage tough times, because I realized by that time I not only had textbook learning, but I had some very practical skills. And the people would say, no, thank you. But I persevered. I learned not to take it personally. After a while, they would let me come and speak for free, but nobody would come. So all my friends would come, and after a while, they could actually do sign language. As I said in my talks, they had supported me so much and been there so many times. And after a while, everything kicked in. So I was traveling all over, and one day I was giving a talk in Nashville. And there were 4 ballrooms in a row. Me, Dan Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote Blink, and the guy who was doing Spencer Johnson's Who Moved My Cheese. And it suddenly occurred to me there was something wrong with this picture. They had books and I didn't. So I came home and announced to my family that I had now decided to write a book. So I sat up late at night, got up early in the morning, and tried to write the kind of book that everybody expected someone who has a doctorate in psychology to write. I tried to write a self-help book. But then I realized I hate self-help books, and even though the kids might say, I like to tell everybody how to live their life, the fact is it's really not true. So I didn't know what to do, and I sort of really couldn't get a vision for my book, and all of a sudden I looked across the room, and I said to myself, there's my book, because as I looked across the room, I saw this man sitting next to me. This is my husband, Brooks Dyer. Hello, Brooks.
Hello, Teena.
Thank you for being here. And Brooks was the inspiration for my book. Even though my book is endorsed by a lot of mental health experts, even though it talks a lot about cognitive behavioral psychology and about positive psychology and how to go forward in tough times, the truth is I wrote my book as a love story. This is my book. It's called The Cahill Factor, Turning Adversity into Advantage. I did not give the book this title. I might have chosen another title, but this is the one the publisher gave it, and I'm fine with that because it really is about, no matter what goes on in your life, what are some of the strategies and skills that worked for me, and how did we get through this situation where we can sit here 16 years later after our life turned on a dime and say, what a great day. So it's great to have you. How do you feel that I wrote this book about you?
I'm a little overawed, I would say.
I don't think so. How do you really feel about it?
Well, I love it.
I think you love it. We've been having a great time, right?
Yes.
And so the book talks about how Brooks and I first met, and it goes into his early recovery, and then it ends actually as I just start doing keynote addresses all over the world. I speak on resilience and leadership, and again, how to take care of yourself in tough times. But I got to tell you, I learned a lot of this from Brooks. So let's start from the beginning. So I was a single mother with 3 kids, right, finishing up my doctorate.
I remember that part.
You remember that part? And one night, my girlfriend called me. I was also teaching psychology at the local Air Force base. And one day, my girlfriend called me and said, Teena, I've met this guy. He's going to be at that sleazy bar right near where you teach. Will you go with me? And I said, I don't want to go with you. You have to teach tomorrow. I'd have to get a babysitter. And many of people out there watching the show have girlfriends like this. She said to me, you owe me. So I got the babysitter, found something to wear, went off with her, and of course within the first 5 minutes that I was there, I lost her. I couldn't find her. I didn't know what to do. Do I go home? Do I leave this woman here? What do I do? I didn't exactly know what to do. So I sat down on a bar stool and looked out at the crowd, trying to look over everybody's head, and suddenly this guy with twinkling eyes, as I recall, came up to me and said, do you remember what you said?
You don't look very happy.
Yes, you don't look very happy. And in my most secure moment, and if you're single, I want you to listen to this because I want everybody to know that no one could be more pathetic than me. And so as you said to me, you don't look very happy, I turned to you and said, I don't belong here, I'm the psychology instructor. And you laughed. And that was Brooks. He was at the time commanding a squadron of Marine Corps fighter pilots who were on a 2-week deployment at this Air Force base where I was teaching. I'm happy to tell you, he was not in uniform. I did not fall for the uniform, okay? I fell for the laughter and the big smile and the twinkling eyes, however. So a few years later, we married. Brooks's kids were with us part of the time. My kids were there. We had dogs and cats and ferrets, and a snake got lost in the house. Remember that? We came home one day.
Yes,
and you assured me that when we couldn't find the snake, that it had probably died, and a year later we found it on the family room floor, right?
Living on potato chips.
Potato chips and Doritos, I'm absolutely sure. But it was fun, and Brooks used to say that our life was filled with dogs, kids, and rock and roll, and we were having a great time. And then one night we went to bed, and by morning Brooks was given little, if any, chance to live. In the middle of the night, he had had a cerebral hemorrhage, and eventually that was followed by a stroke and by a spinal cord injury. The cerebral hemorrhage, the cause of it was never found, and when we left the university hospital, the doctors, who were great guys, said to me, Teena, we don't know what to expect. Brooks had really had a long haul. He had been in the hospital for a very long time, and unbeknownst to anyone, he had a problem in his spinal cord up by his cervical collar up at the neck. So that was actually the source of later on what would develop into this spinal cord injury. But after weeks and weeks in hospitals, Brooks and I finally went home, and we began that long journey of recovery, right? And
Yes,
one of the most interesting times, or scary times for me, was going home the first time and realizing that Brooks, who's always known how to get from point A to point B as a pilot, suddenly had a very different opinion of how you get from point A to point B as a result of some of the problems that had happened, and that was really quite an adjustment. Now, I know that you don't have any memory of this, right? You don't remember what went on before or what went on for a few months after? What's the first thing you remember?
About the stroke?
Yeah, about any of this.
Well, I probably lost 3, 4, 5 months of memory leading up to the stroke. I was an airline pilot, and one thing airline pilots always talk about is their last trip and what they're going to do and where they've been. And I have no memory of it. I know actually if the stroke had happened a day or two before, I might have been in Caracas, Venezuela on a layover.
Right. You went out on a 4-day trip, and I picked you up at Newark Airport, and I think you had come in from the Dominican Republic, actually.
No,
Probably having been in Puerto Rico and Caracas.
The trip, I think, spent a night in Santo Domingo, then Caracas, Venezuela, and Santo Domingo.
Right.
And then back home.
And so one of the things, now here you are, your career ended overnight. You didn't really know that for a long time, but when you really realized that your career had ended, it was a really difficult time for you. That was the time you jumped in your 1986 pickup truck and drove to Denver. That's in the book. It wasn't a happy day for me. But we were, and then I had to fly out because he was hospitalized as soon as he reached our son Andy's house in Denver. But then there was no place to stay because the Pope was visiting, which I thought was good timing because we needed all the help we could get. But we finally got to stay at an Air Force base for a while till they made sure that I could drive him back, and then I had to drive you back in that hard red pickup truck with no radio. But it was actually a good ride for me and for us because I think it was during that time that we sort of looked at each other and said, we've got to figure out how to work this out.
Nebraska is a wonderful state.
John Gottman, who studies relationships all the time, talks about one of the important variables in a marriage is to be friends to one another. And I would say that in those early stages when you were trying to figure out how do you go forward with this sort of instantaneous loss, and I was trying to figure out how not to be mad at you for changing, even though it wasn't your fault, right? And how I was going to go forward. I'm not so sure we were always such good friends to one another in every moment of the day.
Well, not every moment.
Not every moment, because nobody is all the time. But it took us a while to figure out how to pull this thing off, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a rather large adjustment.
It absolutely was. And one of the things that always amazes me about you, and why when I talk about courage, I always think of you. You know, George Patton said, courage is just fear held one moment longer. And I don't know if you get afraid. I mean, you've done a lot of missions in your life. What happens for you when you're afraid? What do you do when you're afraid?
Well, pilots, you have to control the fear
How do you do that?
by not being afraid and doing
Are you
what you're supposed to.
really and truly not afraid?
Well, it's there, but you can put it. You have to put it in the back of your mind.
Channel it some way? Do you channel it some way?
Or block it. I
Or
don't
block
know.
it? Do you think it comes out later then, after you've completed your mission?
Well, then it's all over.
I'm not so sure. I come from another understanding of that. But the fact is, you are incredibly courageous. And the thing that always amazes me about you is if I had you, you're unable to walk, right? So that the
Well,
people
I can walk
listening-
a little bit.
Right, you can't walk unaided, right? You need a
It's true,
walker
yeah.
or a wheelchair.
Maybe 2 or 3 steps.
Maybe 2 or 3 steps. That's right. Hang on to the steps. I'm with you. And you have a little bit of short-term memory loss, right?
Comes in quite handy at times.
Yes, it certainly does. You know, in order for us to have our long-term memory, we have to be able to hold things in short-term memory for about a half a minute for them to get into long-term memory. So I'm sometimes wondering whether your short-term memory loss is really actually any worse than mine, okay? Because as I'm getting busy, you know, I read this article that said that our retentive memory actually gets better as we get older. They actually studied the guys that guide the planes in. What do they call them? FA, what are they called?
Air traffic
Air
controllers.
traffic controllers. And they found out apparently that a lot of them do better as they get older than they did when they were younger. Even after 60, they do better. And so I take great heart to that, even though I can never find my purse.
Well, I think there's a large number of them burn out.
Well, I'm just talking about memory here in general. I mean, the fact is that it's kind of nice to know that. I mean, I always thought if I were on an airplane with you right now, if it were something that you had flown like a 767 or a 757 or DC-10 or some of those big planes used to fly, while I would not want this to happen, but if there were an emergency, I think that some of your long-term memory would kick in, don't you think?
Sure, but
Yeah, right.
I need a lot of help.
You would need a lot of help, as anybody would. But the fact is, you have a hard time with short-term memory, right? You sometimes can't remember what you did a week ago, not that I can, or what happened yesterday, or
And
the time frame that
Yeah,
things
there's no way to
happened in.
predict.
Right.
Although a spectacular event, you figure it was going to stick a
That's
bit
right.
longer.
Spectacular events stick in your head better, right? So my question to you is, I see all of this, and I see that you've built this great life, and I see all this courage, and the thing that always gets me about you is you never whine. I would whine. Well, how do you feel about, how did you do this? How did you do this, that everything changed so much, and yet you have good humor, you're incredibly valuable to the family, but what happens for you about it all? How do you do that?
Well, I just realized I'm fortunate to be here.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Because the odds were pretty long.
Yes, they were. They were pretty long. So you have gratitude.
Well, I don't know if I'd call it gratitude, but I realize.
Would you call it appreciation?
I think maybe so, yeah.
Yeah, maybe appreciation. And we know when we read the research, people like George Vallot wrote this great book called Aging Well, and he talks about the best adjustment to life as we get older is a life of appreciation and gratitude and knowing how privileged and lucky we are to get to have the lives that we have. And my personal thing is I'm not a big fan of privilege. I love opportunity, and I think the only reason to have privilege is to create opportunity for other people. So one of the things that went on for you in the early stages of your rehabilitation was there was not only this loss of your job, but loss of your social network at the very early stages when you really still couldn't even find your way around Princeton, and you were pretty depressed and you were having trouble reading, and I don't even think you remember most of that, but one of the things you and I talked about is something that you love, and what was the thing that we finally used that you loved that helped you started to get your life back together?
Reading history.
Reading history, right? You had a great-grandfather who was in the Civil War, right?
That's true.
And you had always, as a military guy, you had always been interested in him and in his family. And so what we decided to do, and we got incredibly lucky, We called a wonderful man who I've never met, and I don't know him, but I can tell you he probably changed our lives dramatically. Asked him if you could sit in on some of his classes in Civil War history, and he let you do that. And then, so tell us what happened then. Can you remember any of that?
Well, I think I audited his classes for 3 years, perhaps consecutively. And I tried to keep up with the reading and the memory, and I took notes.
And what I would see is that you would take you a really long time to read, you know, whatever you were supposed to read, and by morning you couldn't remember it, but you didn't care because you could read it again because you loved the material, right? And
sure, yeah.
Yeah, and then we started visiting a bunch of Civil War sites. Can you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, where'd we go?
Well, we've been to Gettysburg.
Gettysburg.
And the interesting part is that when I was in high school in St. Louis, I had written a senior term paper on the Battle of Gettysburg.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh.
That's great. Yes, I remember going there, and I have to say that Chancellorsburg, is that right? What's another one? I can't remember. Antietam, right. And so I learned... Fredericksburg. I learned more about the Civil War than I ever cared to know. And then we went on to the Lewis and Clark history of Lewis and Clark. And yes, I do love Sacagawea. And we went on a group of people that followed their path up the Columbia River, and with naturalists and historians and all that kind of stuff. But I will tell you that, you know, whenever we go through these kinds of medical problems, things change. And I can still remember, and I'll probably start to cry, but I can still remember standing on the battlefield at Gettysburg and seeing all of your energy telling me about whatever it was you were telling me about, probably how the troops were stationed or where they'd launched the battle from or whatever. And that was when I saw my husband again. That was when I first saw you coming back to us a little bit. I don't think you could even remember that, and I probably didn't even tell you that. But when I look back on that time, I really see that passion that you had for learning and that interest that you had in the Civil War was really what helped bring you back to us a little bit.
Well, I don't remember that part.
Yes. Well, so then we go on, and life gets better, right? And Brooks continued to make all kinds of progress, and we had a great time, and that's how we finally got to that place 4 or 5 years ago where I looked at my life and thought, well, good for Brooks. This is one tough cookie. He does a great job, and Brooks is defined not by his disabilities, but rather by his strengths. Because of you, we have a granddaughter who, while she has some wonderful natural talent as an athlete, is a great softball player. Tell us about what you're doing with her in softball.
Well, I played a lot of baseball when I was younger.
You played in St. Louis, right?
Yes.
And you played at Stanford when you went off to Stanford.
Yes.
A little bit, till you maybe partied a little too much. Would that be what? Well, you played baseball for a while. Okay. And tell us about your love of baseball. Let's hear it.
Well, I grew up during World War II, and my parents were baseball fans. In fact, my mother's cousin married a very famous baseball player named Billy Southworth, who managed the St. Louis Cardinals and the Boston Braves when the Braves were in Boston.
And your mother's name was Virginia Brooks, and you're named after her.
I am.
And
yes.
she was a wonderful woman, and she loved the St. Louis Cardinals, right?
Yes, she did.
And what's your favorite team?
Well, still the Cardinals.
The Cardinals, and we're lucky enough to get to go to spring training every year for the Cardinals, and you follow them all the time.
That's right, yeah.
And how many years did you coach Little League when your boys were young and my boys
17.
17 years
Well,
of
it was
coaching
Little League and Babe Ruth.
And Babe Ruth.
And then back to Little League and then back up to Babe Ruth.
And now you're helping Madison with girls softball.
Well, I am helping her, yes.
Yes, you're helping our granddaughter, and you're keeping score for one of her teams, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so what do you think about that? What's the difference between coaching all those little boys that you coached for 17 years and coaching a girl? Do you see any difference?
Yes.
What's the difference?
It's much more relaxing as a grandparent.
Has nothing to do about the gender of the child, right? Okay, it is much more relaxing, isn't it? Isn't that
Yes.
the best thing? Yes. Brooks and I are very lucky that we get to live in an extended family home. We live with our daughter, Mia Cahill, and our son-in-law, Matt Sanitas, and their 3 kids. And I will tell you that Sunday morning, this is how we awoke. Their youngest, they have Madison, Alex, and Brookie. Little Brooks, who's only 2 years old, we call him the surprise child, was named after Grandpa here. And we woke up with Brooks coming into our bed, had on his father's baseball cap, I do believe, his new Thomas the Tank Engine underwear, and he was carrying his sister's metal baseball bat, and he had a softball in his hand, and climbed up on the bed at about 7:30 Sunday morning and said, "Baseball, baseball." So those are the joys of, and they really are the joys of getting to live in this extended family.
It certainly are.
Yes, and the kids get to benefit so much. So what we talked about before is, I think the trick in life, when you've had some changes in your level of functioning, if we look at the research on happiness, the research that Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania and other people have done into positive emotion and positive psychology, it tells us to know what your strengths are, figure out what they are. Sometimes our strengths are really in what we love to do, and then go do it, like I'm trying to been doing with speaking around the country and writing. Go do it, have a passion, and try to make a contribution to this world. And I would say that's pretty much what you do. What do you think? Do you think of yourself? It seems to come naturally to you, though. I mean, you just sort of naturally use your strengths. What do you think?
Well, I do what I can.
Yeah. But do you do what you like?
Yes.
Yeah. You like to be on the baseball field, right?
I love it,
You like
yeah.
to be on the football field. You announced Alex's football league a couple years ago in football, right?
Yes.
You love tennis. You were playing some wheelchair tennis there for a while,
Yes.
which is really tough, right?
Well, it's not too bad.
I think it's tough. I have a hard enough time hitting the ball, let alone making that chair go at the same time. Well, what else do you love to do? What else do you love besides baseball? How do you spend your days? I know something that you love. What do you do every morning?
Well, I have coffee with a group of friends,
And what are they called?
the Romeos.
The Romeos. Everybody in town, I think, knows the Romeos, a group of great guys. I really wasn't too thrilled about the name Romeo when he came home and told me he had joined the Romeos. I went, oh, that's gross. And then laughingly, he told me that it means retired old men eating out. And it's a group of doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs who meet every day down at 10 o'clock, right, down at the Princeton Shopping Center. And you guys really have formed this incredible web of connectedness. Tell us a little bit about a couple of the guys down there and what you do.
Well, there's some former teachers, former professors, several chemists, and pretty much a wide experience, and everybody reads a lot. So we have very interesting chats.
And what do you talk about? What did you talk about today?
Well, today we talked a bit about politics.
Oh, really? Okay. That would have been interesting. All right. What else? What else do you talk about?
Well, it's hard to say. It's whatever comes up, quite often whatever's in the news.
Whatever's in the news. That's great.
Whether it's national, international, or local.
Right. And then when somebody has a rough time, when one of your buddies has a hard time, there you all are for him, and you go to the hospital. If somebody's in the hospital, you help out their
Sure.
families. Recently, you were able to, Tom Hartman was one of the beloved members of this group, and Brooks found out, Tom had told him right before he passed away that his Distinguished Flying Cross and other medals that he had earned as a pilot in World War II,
Marine Corps
pilot, had been stolen. And Brooks, being a retired lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve, went into action with Martha Hartman's permission, and with Martha contacted the Marine Corps, and you were able to have duplicate medals delivered to Martha and the family.
That's right.
I
yeah.
just think that's such a great story, and it's an example of how you guys do take care of one another. And if we look at the research, not only if we've had tough times, but in daily living, what part of our resilience, our ability to bounce back from adversity, is really about having this web of connectedness, not being alone, having people that we get together with and that we care about and to whom we matter, and finding a way to contribute. And this is what you guys do every morning for one another, and I think it's incredible. Plus, I have the year of the wives, and it's just fine with everybody, I think, if you guys go down there for a couple hours.
In fact, I'd have to say that the wives probably drive it as much as the guys do.
I'm not sure. They all love their husbands. It's great. It's great. So, so here we are then. We are 16 years past all of this that began, and we know in terms of your memory and your cognitive abilities that you do way better now than you did, I don't know, 4, 5, 8, 6, 8 years ago. And so the great joy is in medicine now is that we know that recovery is, you know, quite often, not always, but in some cases and in yours, you've been able to get back more and more of your sort of cognitive abilities. And I think part of that is about for you that you just sort of kept going forward and doing the things that interested you. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. What you don't want to do is get bitter and say, why did this happen to me?
Right.
But you just take what you've got and keep going.
Well, I always think when we think about things like, why did this happen to me? I always think that sometimes we say those things in the bad times, but nobody ever looks at the good times and says, why did this happen to me? So, you know, life happens, right? And it's our job to know that we can't control everything that happens, but we can make a choice about how we're going to respond. And we can't control every event that happens in this world, but we can make a choice to be defined not by the event, but rather by our positive reaction to that event. And I believe that's what you did. And that's what you do every day.
But I don't look at it. I don't look at it exactly that way. I don't believe I have a choice. You know, you have to keep moving.
Well, maybe you haven't allowed
forward.
yourself to have a choice. You have to keep moving forward. That's
Yeah.
right. Because no matter what, we can find a way to have a great life, and we can find a way to contribute, at least.
And there's a lot of people in much worse shape than I am.
That's exactly right.
And that's one of the things that, having been in a number of rehab hospitals, you know, I'm familiar with some of that.
But you've been an inspiration to me, and I think that I've learned a great deal, Brooks, from getting to be your wife, so thank you. And the book, The Cahill Factor, Turning Adversity into Advantage, is a love story, but it also has lots of cognitive behavioral psychology in it and a lot of positive psychology, but it's the story of Brooks and what I've learned from him. So as I go around the world talking about resilience and leadership, I'm fully aware that the greatest leader I've met is this guy sitting right next to me.
You know, the good news is that battlefield medical care has improved greatly since I was a young Marine. Today, many soldiers make it home alive because of such sophisticated and competent care. But as you may know, traumatic brain injury is one of the more common injuries in this war, and I know a little bit about that. 16 years ago, I experienced a cerebral hemorrhage followed by a stroke. My traumatic brain injury was caused by a bleeding blood vessel in my brain, cause unknown, and not by enemy action. I was in a coma, out of it for a couple of months, had my wake-up day, and then started my recovery. Traumatic brain injury is an injury that requires years of medical attention and rehabilitation. Yet your life is changed forever. I urge you to support these young veterans and their families and help them get the care they must have if there is any chance for them to have a meaningful life. We must protect those who serve to protect us. We owe them and their families in so many ways. There are many ways to be a patriot. And today, let us also thank all people who have made a choice to contribute to this country in any way, to this state and to our community. Thank a friend for making this a better place to live. Thank a police officer. Thank a fireman. Thank a bus driver or anyone who serves others. And thank a coach, a music director, a teacher, or anyone else who works to protect and develop our youth. Lastly, let us remember the words, we the people. The strength and power of this country rests in us. And each of the veterans we honor today understood that duty. Let us learn from them and let us honor our duty to fulfill the hope and dreams that were fought for right here in Princeton. We are the people, and we must work to protect the idea that became this country. God bless the United States of America and all our patriots. Semper Fi.